have Dan Powers here to tell us about researching his genealogy and then using it to write a fiction novel. And he's also working on how to write narrative in general based on genealogy for both fiction and nonfiction. Dan?
And thank you. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak on both of these, to share some of the genealogy and kind of my writing journey on this. As far as myself, I grew up in Chicago and lived there for the now half of my life. For the first 35, 36 years of my life was in Chicago. In 1986, moved to Door County to teach and work in the school system at Sevastopol and then eventually at Howard Swamico in a variety of roles. Like many people, I grew up knowing virtually nothing about extended family. A few uncles and aunts, the related cousins, you see at Christmas and maybe Thanksgiving, and that was about it. No family stories, no real anecdotes. So basically, I knew nothing. And it wasn't until I was much older, into my 40s, when I started to get interested in asking questions. And of course, by then, everyone's dead. So I learned a little bit about researching. And while I was doing that, I uncovered an extensive family, well beyond a few people that I did know. And that was both exciting, just for the information, but also, as anyone in genealogy knows, raises a lot of questions. Every time you get an answer to one thing or find one piece of data, there are a dozen more questions that pop up of how come this and why this. So eventually, over time, approximately 20 years later, I started to take the information, look back at the few attempts of writing things like a family history or beginning that kind of endeavor, and decided to go the route of a novel, How Long a Shadow, which I self-published in 2020. And in it, I fictionalized some of the findings and many of the questions that were arising as I was doing the research and later on. And also tried, it was my humble attempt to try to honor and breathe life into my family's history. As far as myself and my background in writing, in 35 years, spent a good portion of that dealing in literacy. I was a literacy specialist, both reading, but with an emphasis on writing, working with students at a variety of grade levels, coaching teachers as a literacy specialist, and working with them on a variety of aspects of writing, but and a big portion of the best practices, and trying to move away from just a 5-paragraph essay or writing about your pet snake or whatever you were writing, all of which was important, and we didn't know any different. But as found out more about what the real writers do, trying to bring that back into a classroom situation and figure out ways and learn ways myself of how do you impart that knowledge to the teacher and then to the students. In the 90s, I went through several years of a poetry phase and did a variety, and eventually got to the point where there were some that I liked. I've never tried to publish them, but I learned a lot, because poetry being condensed language, you're dealing with a lot of thinking about both structure and getting ideas across in as few words as possible. And so it was a great training ground, I found. In 2017, excuse me, I had entered actually what became the first chapter of How Long a Shadow in the Hale Prize, which is a competition for artists, and they have one category of fiction. In 2017, and entered a chapter under a different name, and it took second place, which was a big boost to not only my ego, but giving me some confidence that what I was writing wasn't all crap. It actually made sense to somebody who knew about writing. And so with that boost, I went on and completed the novel and finished that and self-published, as I said, in 2020. What I'm going to go through today is kind of a smorgasbord approach, because I wasn't sure who would be here, who's listening, who has what questions, what their background are. So I'm going to touch on a few different topics here, generically. And I apologize if it's information you already know, but if you have questions, please bring them up. So I'm going to touch on a few things about writing in general. Then I'm going to touch on nonfiction and fiction, just a little bit of a look at the difference, a different way of thinking about that, and why I decided to go with the fiction route eventually. Look at family history writing about some thoughts, some examples. One that often comes up is, what do I do so I don't offend somebody? And I'm going to just to let you know right off the bat, I don't have an answer, but I do have some thoughts about that kind of stuff. And then if we've got any questions and answers or comments, we'll go there. And if you have any questions as we go, feel free to ask. So first of all, a little of the background that led to my book, but also is relevant in terms of what I'll be talking about in terms of writing later on. And photograph on the left from approximately the early 70s was a picture of my grandmother in the center, the white-haired lady. And to me, that's a grandmother, you know. She was short, heavy set, white hair, you know, hugged you, and that was grandma. But I knew nothing about her. And as a kid, and I had no questions about it. She was just grandma. She was the only grandparent I knew. I never even thought of, how come I only know one grandparent? What happened to the others? I'm sure in my head I was thinking, oh, they're dead, of course. My father, who is in the lower right-hand corner with the white shirt and the tie, was one of 10, and he was in the middle of the pack. The family that I knew the most were the 3 uncles in back. I'd see them Christmas time around holidays for one time, but you know, the adults were in one room talking and having a highball, which were fashionable then, and the kids were off getting in trouble somewhere else. So there wasn't a lot of dialogue, and I certainly didn't have the wherewithal to be listening and asking questions. The lady in there is my Aunt Kitty, who I didn't really know. She never did marry. She had a separate life, and I just knew nothing about her. But that's 5 of the 10 siblings. The picture on the right is my grandmother again, and approximately, we're guessing age 18, early 20s. Now, she was born in 1881. And for those of you who might know from the dress and could make some inferences from the styles, you know, that fits. That photograph of her as a young woman was one of 2 my grandmother had in her possession when she died. She dies at age 96 in 1978. And as the family went through her possession, she had 2 photographs. This was one of them, of herself as this young woman, which I thought when I got it as an older person, I thought this was cool, because by then I was into the genealogy. The other photograph that was in her possession, I'll come to later. This was Grandma's house. She lived after her life and raising the kids in the city. She eventually somehow, and I only heard from an uncle somehow that somebody loaned her the money. She had purchased this place out in Round Lake, Illinois, which is far northern section of Illinois, close to the Wisconsin border. It also became, and I'll mention this periodically through, it became a scene in my book. This was actually the house my parents were living in at the time when I was born. And one of those little few anecdotes I had was my mother saying a few times that I had almost been born in a taxi cab. And I missed it by 10 minutes or something like that. And I already thought, yeah, big whoop, and went out to play whatever I wanted to do. Well, when I started to piece it all together, realized my parents were living here at the time. She obviously went into labor. They got a taxi to take her to the nearest hospital, which was in Waukegan, Illinois, where I was born. And then within a year or 2, they moved into Chicago. As a middle-aged teen, I can't remember, 16, 18, but I had a car, and I grew up without a car. My family didn't have a car. I had the first car in the family. I drove out here, 1, to see if I could find it, 2, to see Grandma. No particular reason. It was just a place to go and drive my car and have a conversation. But the fact that I did that stuck in my head and did become a scene in the book later on. And I only mention that in terms of if you're going to write, you're going to be amazed with, and sometimes you want to purposely mine your own memories of the little things that you do remember that might connect and really be important, especially if you're trying to tell a story about your family. This was my father in war in 1945. The one thing I knew about that he served in the postal service, because he worked in the main post office in Chicago before the war. My father was older. He was born in 1908. And he was drafted as, I'm assuming he was drafted into the war, older, worked in the postal service and was in Birmingham, England, and eventually ended up in Paris, France. Again, those two facts just became little scene pieces in the story that I started to write later on. They're standing outside of what's called the boar's head. It's hard to see up in the upper right-hand corner. It looks like a little lamp at the top of the black hole there. Is where I set that scene. And he had never talked about it. But I knew from somewhere he had bartended a little bit. And that's all I knew. So I pieced that together and that became a scene in the story. This, which you may or may not be able to read it a little bit, but I wanted to point it out. I started with knowing, as I said, nothing about family and very few names. I'll come back to this a little bit later, but I ended up with 2 burial records from Calvary Cemetery, which is on the Evanston-Chicago border. And when I came across this particular document refers to one plot purchased in 1869 by my great-great-grandmother, Jane Powers. It's a 16 by 10 plot of ground. It had 22 bodies in it. So all of a sudden I had this and then eventually a second one that had 18, again, a 16 by 10 plot. So I went from having virtually no names to having 40 some names, and some of which I could pretty quickly piece together. Other, I had no idea who they were. Several of whom to this day, I don't know who they are, but I do know the practice was, you know, they were poor Irish family in Chicago. People died all the time. The neighbor's kid died, a friend's kid died. You had no place to bury them. We have a plot. They weren't, it wasn't until the cemeteries were required to put in the concrete vaults that eventually 6 people in each plot ended up the max you could have. But this was purchased in 1869. So that's how far back it went and raised a lot of questions. This just, again, as I was doing my own research, ended up going to some Latter-day Saint offices, basically, and one down off of Mason Street in Green Bay. This kind of stuff can be found online now, I believe. But I knew from a death certificate of my great-great-grandmother that on there was listed that she had emigrated in 1852. So that's all I had. Came from Ireland, 1852, according to one document. I ended up finding this manifest, and this is a typed version of it. It's the actual manifest on here. You couldn't read it. From March 31, 1852. Now, I cannot swear that these are my great-great-grandparents, but the Jane Powers who bought that cemetery plot's maiden name was Shields. And you'll notice at the top of this, number 309, Jane Shields, age 20, female laborer from Ireland. 100 or so people further down, we have a Patrick Powers, male, 20, Ireland. Now, like I say, I cannot swear that that's them, but the fact that I had the 1852 immigration, they and family members are both on the same boat, coming in the year that 1852 they're supposed to be. I'd like to think it was them on the ship Washington out of Liverpool, but nope, that's one of the things about genealogy. Once you start it, some things you never know for sure. or way beyond my research skills. Okay, the other photograph in my grandmother's possession was this fellow. As we started to look at this and different people in the family, there was no label on it. Nobody had any idea who this person was. Some would say, oh, that looks like your cousin Kevin's son, or this looks like so-and-so. This looks like someone else. Well, my thinking was, why would a woman who was estranged from her husband, and that's part of the story, but I hadn't mentioned, by 1930, my grandfather, this character, was no longer on the census. We all thought well, I wasn't alive. Everyone thought he was dead, including my mother when she got married in 1937. I find out he dies in 1954. And doing some more research, I find him living with his mother, that Jane Shields, elsewhere in Chicago. Bottom line was, again, it's an inference, but my thinking was, why would a woman, until the day she dies at age 96, hang on to two photographs of approximately the same period? I knew from my research that her husband, my grandfather, was 18 years older than she. The clothes, everything fit. So I believe this is my grandfather, but I can't swear to it. He is also, because of that estrangement and the effect that had on the family, became kind of an underlying plot structure to the novel. So the way I think of it is Edward P. Powers becomes the model of the shadow in How Long a Shadow. And a couple of just other points, DNA matches. If you're into genealogy, you may have done this. If you haven't, I think it's worth a try, although there are downsides to it. Having done that in somewhere approximately 10 years ago, 10 years ago, I ended up getting a call from a woman looking for a birth mother. Actually, I got contacted via Ancestry at that point. Wrote back and asked a little more information because I just wasn't going to blurt out. I had no idea what she was looking for, and she's giving me more information, and I'm thinking, this is my cousin Nancy. It's who she's looking for, and it turns out to be that. And they've spent the last 8 years making up for all this lost time. But Nancy had a child at 17 or 18, put up for adoption. That was the end of it. Those records were sealed until fairly recently, about 8-10 years ago. So that was very interesting. And then on my maternal side, a second cousin contacted me, who on that side of the family, I knew nobody. And she had a lot of background information about my mother's family, including the fact that my grandfather there would have been adopted. I don't know that my mother even knew that. Her maiden name was probably an adopted name and not her actual blood lineage. So a lot of interesting things come out of here, and anyone in genealogy knows that. So moving on to the writing portion. And I apologize, this is kind of blurry, but this will just be some generic points about writing. If you look up purposes of writing, this is the type of thing that pops up. Generically speaking, we write to inform, to entertain, to explain, persuade, argue, evaluate, and to express. And a lot of times, several of those things are happening at the same time. But if you're going to write and want to write even moderately well, you need to be kind of aware of and do some thinking about, why am I doing this? And a place to start is, okay, what's the purpose of what I'm going to be writing? And this kind of stuff you can find online, all kinds of them that give you more information, and a lot of them overlap. Narrowing it down a little bit further, oftentimes those same ideas are narrowed into 3 categories. And actually, indeed, these are the 3 categories that through the writing standards that most states and schools in states use in their teaching curriculum would be based around these pieces of information. If you're in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin state test your children might be taking is going to deal with writing in one of these 3 categories. And so it takes those several and brings it down to informational explanatory writing, which is just what it seems to be and is often used in genealogy. And I played with some of that, and I'll give you some examples later. Persuasive, argumentative writing. The more I think about it, that's not used so much. If you're writing something and your purpose is to argue that, you know, your sibling was a total jerk, that's not a good reason to be writing. You may be using this category, but that's not what this is about. And then narrative writing. And narrative just simply refers to you are telling a story of some sort. And we'll spend most of the time focused on that, although we're going to hit both of them. Again, generally speaking, in writing, if I were going to give any advice of what to think about in terms of what do I do as a writer, what do I focus on, I would suggest these three elements, or what are often referred to as traits. And you'll notice it's 3 of 6. I'll mention the other 3 in a moment. But these are the 3. One is any writing has to deal with an idea. Otherwise, it's like talking to the guy in the bar stool next to you who's just rambling on and going, and there's nothing behind it. If you're going to write and put something down, you have to think about the idea. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. That's number 1. Number 2 is eventually the organization. How do you put it down so that the reader can make sense of what you're talking about? Because if the organization is a mess, the reader's going to get lost and they're going to not want to read whatever you've got. Those 2, I would say, would be the key. Something I want to say about organization is you may not have that totally in your mind when you start to write. Don't let it get in the way. Play with the ideas, start putting things down, eventually come back to how am I going to organize this information. And if you're writing about genealogy, you've got a lot of information. And depending on what your purpose is, you're going to have to try to figure out how to organize it. Voice, for our purpose, we'll just say, is hopefully when somebody reads whatever you're writing, does it sound like you, or do you sound like a textbook? And because this is about writing family history, about family, or about yourself within the family, you want some kind of personality to come across. Now, this shouldn't be made up. The goal of writing is to make it sound like you. And sometimes you'll get people who give you feedback of, you sound like you just got a new dictionary, or something of that nature, or, you know, this really sounded like you, which I take as a huge compliment. Or even to the point of, if you've got a character, I could believe that character. It sounded like I would imagine this character to be. So that's part of voice also. So if these are strong and well-crafted, readers are going to engage with the text no matter which genre you're using, fiction, nonfiction, or any of the sub-genres within that. Said 3 of 6, the other 3, word choice, sentence fluency, mixing up the sentences so they're not all the same, and then the conventions, which when I went to school, writing was about conventions. Did you spell it right? Did you indent? Did you punctuate? It wasn't about ideas. It was some about organization. It wasn't so much about word choice. It was about conventions, and luckily that's flipping. Now, for the teachers in the audience, I'm not saying conventions aren't important. They are crucial, but they're not the be-all, end-all of writing. And although it's not one of the original 3, it later got added onto this 6th trait idea, the idea of presentation, which is simply how do you put it down on the paper. In some cases, it doesn't matter a lot. Other times you want it to look nice, you'll be passing it on. If you're trying to put out a book or want something published, how it appears becomes very important. But those are minor to those first 3 of idea, organization, and making it sound like you. Going a little bit deeper, this idea of ideas is you actually doing some thinking and you considering what do I want to say? Where am I going with this? What's my purpose? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Why is this important? You may not start there. When I ended up, I said earlier, 20 years later, I ended up with a novel. The beginning was just collecting information and sorting it. And then it became trying to create the little context, the history behind it, and writing a lot of informational stuff and trying to make it sound interesting. But as the idea shifted and my purpose shifted, I had to change what I was thinking and where I was trying to go. The idea of topic is not quite the same as idea. The topic is genealogy, family, etc. But the idea becomes much more focused. And if you're trying to actually write as opposed to just document, that becomes important. What's your purpose? Next thing is the idea of genre, and we'll come back to this in fiction and nonfiction in a moment. But you can write about, I've met a fellow recently who has 2 books that are epic poems out. It can be, you can write it if one is a poet and can write in terms of a genre in poetry about family. Dramas, plays, etc. All of them are of a potential, but you got to make a decision. Mine changed over time. It eventually ended up as a novel. And something that often isn't thought about is once you get to thinking seriously and starting to write seriously, you need to think about your audience for a few reasons. Who is going to be reading this? For some, it's just yourself. You're writing it and sticking it in a drawer. But eventually, your kid or somebody's going to come across it. Not that you should be writing for them, but realize if you are who your audience is, because if you're writing above them or below them, they're not going to be interested. So the idea of who might my readers be is something to consider. Bringing in the idea of purpose that I've mentioned a few times, connected with idea, is it becomes essential. Think about it, even if a grocery list, there's a purpose behind it, especially if you have a memory like mine. That's the purpose. You don't care how it's presented or the word structure, etc. You need a list. If you're trying to write a bestseller, there are generally formulas. There are things you have to include if you are trying to reach a certain market in terms of bestseller. A memoir, what's your purpose? Why are you writing? A memoir being based on the Latin root of memory, remembering of some portion of your life. And why are you talking about that? What is the purpose you're trying to get at? So again, just generically, once you start to think about writing seriously and start to do it, these are some of the things to think about. And I added that PS on there of if your writing is to get even with somebody, writing a memoir to show how horrible someone in your life was, or great, that's not a reason to do that. I've got a friend who has a memoir out about horrible abusive relationships. It wasn't about how bad the other person was, and I'll have a quote on this later on, but what she had went through to come out the other end into the person she was. So the purpose wasn't to talk about how bad somebody was, but to recount her journey and what she had gone through and how she came out. Which is very different, I just want to add here, than it's not like taking a literary selfie. If you're writing for your own ego, it's going to come across that way and people aren't going to like it. But writing about your real life and your experiences, that is important. Purpose determines also how much work you're going to put into it. You're not going to spend a lot of time, at least most people, unless you're compulsive, on lists. But if you're going to write something seriously and your purpose is to get it to a certain audience, you're going to put more time into it, more sweat. As I said on mine, once I realized I wanted to turn what I had into a novel, from that point, even though the genealogy was done, I had played with some documentary writing and context. From that point on, it took me 4 years. I did write during the summer. I wasn't, a slave to 8 hours a day, so it varies, but that's a lot of time. It probably was somewhere close to 1,000 hours to come up with a novel for somebody who hadn't done it before. And purpose looking at it a little slightly different way, if purpose can be considered at all levels of why am I writing this book, to why am I writing this chapter? Why am I writing this sentence? Why am I choosing this word? Now that's drilling way down. If you're not really into the writing and you're just collecting the information, you're not going to worry about that. But the further down and the more serious you take your own writing, you start to question of why am I choosing this word? This word isn't right. This sentence, you hear writers talk about that kind of stuff all the time, at least good writers. But again, it depends on what your purpose was at the beginning. Why, if you're writing it for yourself or just a family as a document, you're not going to worry so much about this. If you're getting more serious, this comes into play. Okay, switching over briefly to nonfiction versus fiction. Just a list of, there's nothing new about what I've got here. Biographies, autobiographies, auto being self-biographies about yourself, memoir, which I've already mentioned as being a slice of life based on often a memory. It can be anywhere from a page or two to full-blown hundreds of pages of memoirs, particularly of famous people. There are a dime a dozen, it seems like now. Character sketches, a lot of times in family writing, there are people that you related to or want to explore, and your focus is a much shorter piece dealing with a character. I mentioned that Hale competition. That had a limit of 4,000 words on it. You could only focus on a character within some kind of a setting. With something going on. So that's a little different. It doesn't have to be a large 100-page effort or more. Just telling the family stories as you've heard them before, anecdotes, and as I said, turning into plays, poetry is a possibility for those with that bent, essays, a thesis, and then trying to prove it of something about the family is all possible ways of writing about your family or people in it. On the fiction end, there's a few less. And I'm sure people could come up with more than I have here, but the character sketches, again, I think are very credible. And I tend to write that way in my newest piece or novel I'm working on. It's not a family, based novel, but characters are very important and then how they interrelate. The short story, which is very popular. The novel, bigger, plays, poetry. So overlaps on some. There's also often an overlap within fiction. Oftentimes there's factual information put there. And in nonfiction, sometimes it gets interpreted that gets close to fiction. So the lines blur sometimes. Now, for me, I had come across this quote, and I've got to say, Paul Thoreau, I don't know. He's an author. I have not read him, but I had come across this quote. I think it was from a blog that I really liked. Nonfiction teaches you a lot of answers. Fiction gives you a lot of questions. Now, he was talking about reading from a reader's perspective, but I thought this was a great way to think about writing in general. Is if you're writing nonfiction, generally your purpose is to give information, answers, so to speak. And if you're dealing in fiction, it's usually starting from a lot of questions. And that's kind of where I'm going to start to focus on is the questions you start to ask yourself in your writing, particularly if it's fiction. Now, as far as deciding which one you're going to do, it's going to depend on you. A few things to think about are the ideas and subject matter, obviously, and in this case, it's going to be family history. It might be all about a person. It might be a relationship. If you're talking about, 5 generations of an entire family, all of that you have to take into account. It'd be much easier to write larger pieces, nonfiction, if you have the information. If you're taking some interesting bits of that and want to make it into a novel or a longer piece, then you may want to decide to go fiction because you're going to invent a lot of the material, which is what I did in mine. A lot of actual information in there. The family genealogy in the story is my family genealogy. But then the story and the main characters all come off of that. The vision for your writing, again, that kind of goes back to your purpose. What do you want to accomplish? Do you see yourself as wanting to become a writer? Are you a writer and you want to go further? Purpose and goals of your writing that I've mentioned before, your audience, as I mentioned before, the genre you're most interested in or familiar with. That's a place to start. Whichever way you go or are going, no matter which genre you're picking, then this is not original with me, but I do forget the author, but it was something in education that I focused on was, if you're going to write, you have to read. And if you're reading consciously, read like a writer. In other words, not just the character and following the action and plot, but thinking in terms of what is the author doing here? What does the author want me to believe or go? Why is the author doing it this way or saying it this way? That starts to help you learn how to write. And then the converse of that is to write like a reader. As you're writing, think about your reader. What information do they need? When do they need it? So they don't get lost, but they want to turn the page. And you don't want to confuse or lose them, because obviously there's a zillion things out there to read. If it's gone in the first 5 pages, if you don't have them hooked, the book's going to go under the bed and it's gone. So moving on to the writing about family piece, and mostly thoughts and examples. But I want to start with one reason to write stories about your family. And this I got from a Peter Quinn, and how you know when it's time to write is right to write a memoir. But I like the concept of this. So why write about family history? We carry the past with us like a book. Whether we open it or not, it doesn't go away. Wounds that heal or not, moments of grace and humor and humiliation are with us until the end. We never get over them because, as William Faulkner wrote, the past is never dead, it's not even past. A very eloquent way of putting all that crap's in us, all that knowledge is in us, all those questions are in us, whether we're acknowledging or paying attention, conscious or unconscious. That becomes, for people in genealogy or who enjoy family history, that becomes what pushes you, is to learn about that and those connections. So I really like that quote, is what it amounted to. Now, what's the main reason not to do this? Now, this is assuming you want to write. And this is a quote from an author, Joyce Maynard, who actually looking at an online course through the great courses that she teaches, and I borrowed it from there. Sometimes what can hold us back from sitting down to write a very personal story is fear. A fear of being judged by readers, a fear of confronting uncomfortable aspects of our past, even the fear that there's nothing really interesting about our lives. All of those things can stop you, but I know from my own experience, fear was it, which is why I said earlier, getting that second place out of that Hell Prize overcame a lot of that, gave me at least enough self-esteem about my writing and trust in myself that it was worth doing. So all I can say is, if you're writing and spending time in it, lots of times you're going to ask yourself, or you're just going to feel that fear come up of, should I put this down? How do I say this? Or who's going to feel this way about it? Or will my wife like it, my husband like it, whomever, or not like it? But fear, like as Roosevelt said, all we have to fear is fear itself. It's something that you need to push back past. Now, I've said literally and inferred a few times how important questioning is to writing. Basically, it's the whole thing, because if you ask the right questions, what you start to put down in paper is going to make sense. So writing stories, fiction or nonfiction, is about asking questions. At times, they're going to be questions about yourself. both as a writer and as a character, or why your purpose of why you're writing, which is the second one. You're gonna be asking questions about your story. Where should it go? Does this make sense? Is it realistic? Does it accomplish what I want? And the characters, what are they like? And especially when you're talking about family, many obviously will know who these people are. Even if they're dead, they will have some connection to it, or know you are connected to them. And again, asking questions about your audience. Who am I writing for? So those are some of them, questions. But I'd say the biggest one is to start by asking yourself, why? Why should I take the time, or what's inside me that's pushing me, nagging me to want to put something down in paper about the family? And that takes some work to figure it out. And when that nag gets big enough, you'll sit down and start to do it. A lot of it has to do with time. I wrote this after I retired. It's not but lots of people, I know lots of people are writing very full lives, kids and all that, you know, Irma Bob Becks and people like this, they're writing all the time and have made good money off of it. But if you're going to write about family, there's something nagging at you, and listen to that and try to figure out what that is, because that will help you figure out what you want to write about and where it's going. For myself, and now that I look back at this, and this was, I found that I wrote about 1995, why I wanted to write about my family. And this is what I wrote, pedantic as it sounds. To pry open history and hear the whispers of one's genesis is the goal of many amateur genealogists. Unfortunately, my desire to document family history began in earnest too late to collect the stories and lore that surrounded each member. My paternal grandmother, Mary Buckley Powers, died age 96. She was famously closed-lipped about her history, so even the few questions asked by family went unanswered. She was the only grandparent I knew. When I look at that now, I cringe a little bit of how the wording, etc. But the idea was there. I wanted to try to bring this alive. I wanted, because there were no stories, I wanted to create the stories, and we had no information. So that's where that came from. That was how I answered that why question. Why fiction? And for me, this quote makes a lot of sense. And I came across this recently and saved it. And this is from a document, 6 Benefits of Reading Fiction That Will Help Your Child Succeed. It's a blog. Fiction has a power that no other form of communication does. The power to insert you fully and completely in someone else's mind. Is a meld between the mind of the reader and the writer, and the minds of the readers and characters. When you read fiction, you're seeing the world through a character's eyes. In my case, having all of the people, the potential of those people you saw on that one burial record, and no stories, this really appealed to me, is I wanted to create the stories that I never had. And that became the genesis of the novel. As I got going into it, a major question that became part of the focus of the plot was, is genealogy destiny? And in fact, I put it on the back of the cover of the book. And if I'm selling the book someplace, oftentimes people will pick it up and they'll say, oh, is genealogy destiny? That's an interesting question. And that's what I deal with. And it's kind of a motivational force in 2 of the characters, Kevin being the main character. But having that question in my mind as I was writing allowed me to, as I'm trying to think, where am I going to go with this? I can't come back to what am I trying to talk about and what am I trying to include and deal with this question of genealogy destiny. So it helps shape the idea and it helps shape the purpose for me. Now, writing can also be documenting, and that doesn't mean just a family tree. Matter of fact, it doesn't mean that. It goes beyond that. Informational writing of any kind about the family. I'll show you an example or 2 in a minute. Family names, etc. But you're focusing on getting the information out and maybe giving it some context. You're not really, your purpose isn't to tell a story, it's to put out information to an audience. Again, this goes back from actually 2006. At this point, I was still dealing with all my genealogical information and trying to piece it together and give it some context. But at this point, I didn't have a novel in my mind. And I'm not going to read all of this, but basically, this is where I was going in terms of documenting. So writing an example of a draft, looking at documenting. The genealogy of my branch of the Powers family is, as of 2006, traceable back to the 18th and early 19th century. This era, which is shaped by many events, not the least of which is that it unfolds within the context of the first half of the Victorian age. For some reason, and I have no reason why, understanding why, that was important to me. Whenever I would see something about that period, I started thinking of my family. So that became part of the context I was trying to put around what I was writing while I was documenting information. So I wasn't trying to tell a story, I was just trying to put down some information within a context. It goes on to talk about families' names being passed on to me, particularly, and this is midsection of my cousin, Maureen, who for a high school genealogy project, basically had to cry to get grandmother to give her the 4 names that are at the bottom, because grandma didn't want to talk about anybody. And it wasn't until she was weeping, I'm a fail, I need that grandma gave her 4 names. So eventually those 4 names are what I came across that ended up pushing me in the direction of one more further in the genealogy, because I knew who these people were by the time I got this information and where the story was going to go. But again, I've got it here simply as a purpose of when you're documenting. There are a lot of great books out there by very famous people making a lot of money and sharing good history by documenting information, be it family or general history. So that's a good, solid way to go if that's the way you lean. Once you start to shift over to storytelling, it's a little bit different. You start to talk about family histories. Now, this can still be nonfiction. You may know a whole lot about your family history, and you want to recount stories that you have heard over and over, but put it down in writing and make it more interested in your own writing. You might deal with the simple history, individuals. Storytelling needs conflict. There has to be some tension in there somewhere. So if your idea is to tell a story, that becomes integral. Doesn't have to be a huge conflict, but something that is motivating the characters to move in certain directions. And again, as I said before, the purpose is to give life, breathe life into the past. It's going to deal with people, but often in the context of events, places, and things. Something I found, and I kept changing the heading on this, I finally landed on no. First I had beware or be careful or something like this. But anybody who's written about genealogy that I've talked to at all, and definitely for myself, had something similar to this. Is as you write personal stories about family, you find you're both revealing stuff about you, the author, as you're writing, and chances are it's going to change you. The largest example I found, I was well into the book when all of a sudden I realized my main character, Kevin, who in my mind was starting out thinking of this grandfather who had abandoned all the family, etc., and is only mentioned a little bit in the book, but is constantly referred to, was just an SOB who had, ditched his family, and how despicable is that, etc. As I was creating Kevin, more and more, Kevin started taking on some sympathy towards the grandfather. And in my own head, I kept thinking, where is this coming from? And how does it relate to me? And actually, as it turned out, it was important in dealing with the main character, Kevin, as you went on. It became a big part of the conflict in there. So this stuff you're going to find it changes the way you think about some things. Just a word, and I don't want to sound pedantic or judgmental on this, but more and more I've listened to other people talk and just reading things and reading what people write, and particularly in today's world, that as you're writing, truth is always your version of the truth, but truth has to be what you're after if you're writing about family. Not, as I said before, to blast somebody you thought was an SOB, or you loved your mother and you're just trying to beatify her or something like that. If you're going to write and want to do it seriously and want to get yourself involved, you're trying to reach some truth. So writing about your family must be about truth as best as you can. Anything else, I think, is a betrayal of the person and of yourself. And I think it's true of fiction and nonfiction. So end of lecture, I apologize for sticking that in there, but I think it's important. This is kind of an example of it, and it's Alyssa Bernick in the bottom. And I just liked it because I thought it illustrated this point, which is hard to see on my screen. I was less worried about exposing my family's secrets than with opening doors to the past that I purposely kept locked. And I've alluded to that as purpose before. I was breathing life into dangerous secrets, but the skeletons I was making dance were my own. In other words, dealing with her truth and whatever happened to her, and I have not read what she's referring to here, but if you're coming from that point of view, it's not that nobody's going to blast you for it, but it's a way to, I think, be honest about what you're writing. So that's why that was there. Back a bit to the connection of questions, ideas, and purpose. What do you want to know? This is some notes that I had written around the year 2000. So at this point, novel wasn't started, but I was going back over genealogy I had already looked at and playing with writing up historical pieces about it or something. But I found myself, I wondered who they were. All those names buried in these 48 people in these two little graves. Who were they? I wondered if I would have liked them. That had never crossed my mind before. And then even more important, I wondered if they would like me and would have felt good about having a hand in creating me. Would they recognize parts of me as also being parts of themselves? And then it's a little disjointed, but referring to the fact that I was looking at burial records. History was suddenly made of flesh, or at least bones. It was a transcendent experience, and it changed the way I thought about myself. Now, that sounds hyperbolic, and it could be taken that way, but ever since I started the genealogy, and ever since I tried to put it into the book, I found myself looking at things and taking myself a whole lot less serious, but also feeling a whole lot more rooted, which is often why roots or finding your family roots are in family series on genealogy, etc. It really does root you. And as I say at the bottom, it became a motivational factor that pushed me over the top of spending the time it took to produce a novel. Now, I debated about putting this in, but I wanted to try to give a little connection of what I'd actually put into the book in terms of genealogy and the research itself. When I hadn't thought about this before, but basically the character in the book, Kevin, is, for his own reasons, as a retired person, starting to look at his own genealogy and starting to research it. So I realized I'm a writer writing about somebody else doing research that I'd already done. It was kind of a cyclical thing, but I knew my purpose for the passage, and this is just a little excerpt of it, was to try to get people not into genealogy to understand kind of what you feel like as you're looking for the past. So if you'll excuse me, I'll just read this piece. This is taking place at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and if you knew that, it's a huge archaeological library on the north side of the city, which is where my family lived, literally lived a few blocks away from there, where the Chicago fire had come up to, so it had a lot of connections to the period I had going in the story. But Kevin goes to the Newberry Library, gets in there, I've got this happening in 2016, but it actually happened in the 90s. So I was kind of updating and mixing and putting in computers where the computers weren't there before. But anyhow, refocusing, Kevin found the page where the mid-1860s color tins resided. That's Kevin's last name. He quickly scanned down the column of given names. He was more than disappointed to find Patrick, who he's looking for, was not among them. He went through the list again. Referencing here the actual documents, when I went to the Newberry, they would hand you directories from 1860 of everybody in Chicago. And so you're holding a book that is that old and going through the names. And there's just something really cool about having something that old in your hand and looking and trying to, looking for somebody. I also, just as a side note, excuse me for interrupting myself here, is I remember opening those directories and feeling confused and then realizing I was looking for phone numbers because it was called a directory. And I'm looking at an 1860 directory. Anyhow, so he's looking for Patrick. He went through the list again. Then he saw Cullerton, Jane, widow of Patrick, H, which stood for House 154 Townsend. Kevin stared at the words. He traced his finger back and forth under the listing as if to underscore it and etch it into his imagination. His mind floated in disbelief atop a flood of questions. He had just reached back through time, through 152 years to be exact, through a century and a half of Chicago history, and touched his great-grandparents, people whom he'd never heard of a month ago. Enveloped in the moment, he didn't want to think or move. He just stared at the line to make sure it wouldn't somehow disappear back into the past. Then the floodgates opened in terms of questions. I'm too late. Patrick is dead. How did he die? Where was he buried? Where the hell is Townsend? What happened to James? So again, the purpose there is just an example of, as you're writing and trying to make something come alive, but to capture, it was an exciting moment for me, and I was trying to capture it there. So more general questions asked about just writing constantly, your 5 W's and how. Who or what is most important to you? If you're trying to write a character sketch or a memoir or something, trying to decide who is a person and what's most important about them. One way to think of that is, when you think of your family, is there some piece of that that you find yourself obsessing about? For me, it was this grandfather once I found out about him. For other people, it's about a relationship. It might even be about a thing, an object that's an artifact, a lamp that came down, and you just find it periodically just constantly in your mind that you're obsessing about it. That's a good hint that that's good material for writing. The why question, why do you feel connected to whatever that person or thing or event is? And then doing some digging, and sometimes you do that by writing, is what is the connection and the relationship? Why is it so important? Those become the reasons behind why you want to write. Another why or how question is, how are you going to fit into whatever you're writing? And it depends on the style again, the genre and what you're trying to accomplish. You're the writer, of course, but you're also the narrator. And those two things are not always the same. The narrator is how you're going to tell the story. The character, in my case, there's a fair amount of my own history in there, or things that I've thought, pieces of that I can somebody who read it recently said, this reads like historical fiction. It's kind of both. So again, questions becomes the key. This is another documenting piece, and we're almost at the end here, and I'm going to get the original. I'm not going to read all this, but my point here on this one was, even when you're documenting something, people, the readers later down the road, are going to often see something about you in there. Now, this was an excerpt, an ant, and you're not going to be able to see that on this thing on the screen. It was just some folded paper she put together. She documents and talks about her babies when she had them, etc. And then there's a passage here It's documentation, it's telling a story, but it's also, I learned more about my aunt than I ever had known. Before I married, I was a PBX operator for the Chicago and Alton Railroad for 9 years in Chicago, Illinois. Many a happy day I spent there on both day and night shift. Working for the railroad in those days was like belonging to one big happy family. This would have been pre-World War II. So somewhere in the 30s, I would imagine, early 40s. I had many friends and admirers. Being a switchboard operator is the most interesting work in existence. One talks with people over and over, sometimes for days, weeks, months, or even years, without ever meeting them face to face. You try to imagine what they look like and what a pleasant surprise, and sometimes what a shock when your knight in shining armor turns out to be a scrawny, undernourished Mr. Milquetoast sort of person. When Christmas rolled around in the first year, I had been an operator. I had received so many gifts that I had to take them home for 3 nights. There were hose and trinkets, candies, merchandise, certificates, crisp green bills in bank folders. Reading that, I'm getting a picture of who my aunt was. She's just telling her history. She's not trying to beg, she's not, but it comes through. I'm sure at the time she probably wasn't thinking about it. She was just talking about that because the passage goes on to talk about her meeting her husband, my uncle. Another example, and again, I'm not going to read all of this. My Uncle Joe, and he was in that picture I started with, standing behind my grandmother. Somewhere along the line, decided he was going to write about the members of his family. And this was found on his computer after he was dead by my cousins. And in essence, what he did was he changed the last name. And except for himself, everybody had the same name. And he typed about a page or two talking about each person and their personality. The only character who got his name changed was Joe himself. He changed to Josh. But I think, again, it shows how, even though he's putting this down and calling it fiction, so to speak, what he was trying to accomplish was passing on information about his family. It also became a key and one of the a huge motivation and help as I was writing, because I learned things about my dad, because he was one of the characters that I had never heard or known before. So Josh, who was actually my Uncle Joe, was almost 4 years old when he had his first encounter with the old man. And little did he know it was the only one he would ever have. Ma had warned me to stay in front of, and I want to get the actual passage because some of it's covered. Ma had warned me to stay in front of the house and not to talk to strangers. I followed the rules. Well, with no toys or playmates, I would have to make up my own fun. I decided to play war. But with no pals to join in, what was the sense in that? Well, I reasoned if you can pretend war, you can pretend you have a rifle and you can pretend to be soldiers. Then it happened. I was hiding behind the bushes playing war when a tall mustachioed man stuck his head over my parapet and asked me my name in a soft voice. I was petrified, but there was no way to escape. I told him, Josh, sir, being polite as Ma had taught me. He told me not to be afraid, that he was my pa. He saw that I was fearful and tried to hand me a silver coin. I told him Ma would kill me if I took money from a stranger. And how comes you call yourself my pa? He shrugged his shoulder and without a word, he laid the coin on the sidewalk and he exited from my life forever. Great writing? No. Fiction? I doubt it. As far as I read this, this was an event that happened. And as I looked at what he wrote about the rest of his family, some of the pieces I knew. It was a great treasure trove. But again, putting it out here as an example of you don't have to be writing novels or fancy stuff, just simply trying to tell the truth. This happened, that happened, because later on, readers are going to find it interesting, as I did. Matter of fact, I'm going to close with the fact that another reason you should write was the previous 2 excerpts from my Aunt Alice and especially my Uncle Joe were the only sources I came across that allow me to actually glimpse what my family's life, particularly my dad's life, was like. Uncle Joe's attempt at fiction directly contributed to my details, to the details I used in my novel, How Long a Shadow. So I'm gonna urge all of you, find the time when you're ready, write. And one of the reasons to write is remembering your audience, and it's going to be your children down the road. Maybe not immediately, maybe not all of them, but there are going to be some, and they're going to be very glad you did it. And with that, I'm going to conclude. And thank you very much for watching, attending, and any questions?
Thank you very much. That was very informative and ring a bell with me, many of the things that you said. I don't know, some of the stories are a little bit too touchy to talk about, but my sister and I started doing our genealogy after my father passed away as a way of bonding, and then she talked to some relatives, older relatives, and had stories that I don't know how we can write them down, but we're the only ones who know these things now. So how do you get started? I don't even know how to get started.
I think in your case, it sounds like it's something you do want to record. Whereas a lot of people just avoid it. I'm not going to touch that. And yes, it's going to have some reflection down the road of people reading this and saying, well, why are they airing our laundry? But I mean, that's what history is an interpretation of what went on. So it can be written in terms of just a recording of what happened. It can be started with, with our interpretation. Do you and your sister agree with what's going on?
We pretty much understand
a
whole lot of things that just came out of the cracks while we were doing, how it is with research.
Sure.
You just come across things.
I could see parts of it becoming individual pieces of writing, which again could go back to a few pages based on an incident and just focusing on that piece and just being careful with language that you aren't choosing biased language that casts blame. So those are things editing can pull out and get rid of that and do that. Because sometimes look at family history and thinking, I've got all this information, and I would think it's a rare person who can pull all of that together, unless they're just, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. So in a case like that, I would try to focus it on a singular, at least that's the first place I would start, a singular event or incident, and kind of build around that, as I'm sure you've read it a million times in short pieces. The other is, changing the incident to something similar that brings out the same feelings and emotions, but it's kind of like changing the names of protecting innocent type of thing. So almost an allegory of what happened. The other is write the damn thing, put it in the box, and let them find it later after you're dead.
Yeah,
it's hard though. Even on my own, I find it's hard for me to write really bad things about a person and trying to create a character who is very nefarious, because I know very few people that are total evil. They're all mixtures. So it becomes, how do you work through some of that? Which goes back to why I keep harping on the questions and ask yourself, why am I doing this? What am I trying to accomplish? And then going with it.
but I find so many stories everywhere. Even when I'm just thinking about things like this granary here in town. The first thing I do is jump into genealogy of families, because you start pulling out things just by tracing people and the lines.
Absolutely. And especially when you start to find out about personalities and this happened because this family was feuding with this family.
Yeah.
And if you get can find that kind of information, but yes, it is. And not everybody's interested in history, let's face it.
Yeah.
And genealogy, family history is a very specific piece of it, but we're all carrying, and we all are part of history, carrying history around. And
these are real stories too. It's not just fantasy.
Right. Yep. I agree. I used to love fantasy and I'll read some occasionally. But I find the real stuff in dealing with this, even if I'm fictionalizing, because I don't know what it is, for me, is just more fulfilling. For others, that's not their thing. But if nothing else, I think you and your sister should sit down and start to write and see what you end up with.
Yeah.
And just keep it secret for yourselves until you decide what you want to do with it.
And I'm often, go ahead,
I'm sorry.
Hmm?
First, I want to apologize for my phone going off. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Wondered if you can write from a perspective of fiction and nonfiction at the same time. Meaning you can write about nonfiction that you're absolutely sure of and you find the facts reveal themselves versus fiction for the things you're not quite sure about, but you sort of think are true and you're putting it together as you did. Can you do a combination or do you pretty much have to choose one or the other?
You can do a combination, and I would say that's exactly what my novel is a combination. As I said, the family genealogy under the Cullerton name is my family genealogy. And I did it because it raised the questions. And if I was trying to make all that up, I'd have to have charts all over the room to figure it out. Since I do the genealogy, so it was in my head.
So do you reveal that in the initial part of your book? Introduction?
I forget exactly. I know I dedicated partially to the family and their memory, but no, I admit it readily. If somebody's buying a book, I'll often say it's based on my family genealogy. But the main, the fiction part is the main character's conflict.
Okay.
Specifically, which is different, which does reflect some of my, but it's the character dealing with something that happened because in the book,
Okay.
and then dealing with it, and everything that happens and he's meeting and what's happening is all fictionalized.
Okay.
In the meantime, I'm putting in lots of basic things, like I said before, a scene in my grandmother's house, very real. I had the photograph. As I described it, I had the picture in front of me.
Yes.
What do I want to say about this? You've got people like Ken Follett writing about building of cathedrals. The story is fictionalized, but the characters are based on the research of building cathedrals and names of people that actually, the architects, etc. So I would guess most of it is some kind of hybrid.
Thank you.
what was I gonna say? I think a lot of historical fiction is just that. It's based on a lot of research and facts, but then there are invented characters in the story. For example, right now, for one book club, we're reading a book called The Gown. And that one's about a couple girls who sewed Queen Elizabeth's wedding gown. And one of the characters for sure is a real person. The other, her friend, is, I'm guessing, fictional.
Mhm.
So it's classified as historical fiction.
Sure. I'm blanking on his name, who wrote Civil War histories, his father. Yeah, no, I can't. His father wrote Killer Angels about Gettysburg, and then he started. Yeah, he has,
Shari or something.
yeah,
It's escaping me too.
and great. And if you know things about the Civil War, and I was interested in that history, all of the facts and the characters, he uses actual people, but then he inserts other people who are fictional and fall under historical fiction. I would have liked to have called this historical fiction. I was a little bit leery. It's got a lot of Chicago history in it, but that's not a focus. It's just things that are happening. So at that point, how much of, but to your question is, I think most writing includes both.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah,
That's
My
really
pleasure, ladies.
And appreciate you taking the time for a minute.
I thought it was enjoyable.